Imagine standing across a battlefield from an enemy that simply would not slow down. Men who marched for weeks carrying the weight of an entire life on their backs, built a fortified camp every single night after exhausting journeys, then woke before dawn ready to fight as if they had just rested in comfort. Now imagine being one of the tribes facing Rome and realizing something horrifying halfway through battle. Your warriors are gasping for breath. Your arms feel like stone. Your legs shake beneath you. But the Romans in front of you still move with terrifying discipline, rotating fresh soldiers into the line, while the exhausted disappear briefly behind shields only to return ready again, over and over until resistance collapses. Because this was not mythology. This was the greatest military machine of the ancient world. And Rome discovered something centuries before modern sports science gave it a name. Endurance wins wars, not passion, not fury, not even bravery alone. The side still capable of functioning after everyone else breaks usually controls history. And perhaps that sounds obvious today. But in the ancient world, this realization transformed warfare completely. Because most civilizations treated battle like a violent explosion of courage and chaos, warriors charging until someone collapsed first, while Rome approached combat more like engineering, methodical, systematic. Almost mechanical, they asked a terrifyingly practical question. What if soldiers could be trained to resist exhaustion itself? And once Rome committed to answering that question, they created a military culture so brutal, disciplined, and psychologically advanced that modern special forces instructors would recognize parts of it immediately. 4 months of training before a recruit even approached battle, endless marches carrying crushing loads, weapons deliberately heavier than real combat gear, construction labor after sunset when other armies slept, breathing techniques, nutrition systems, medical recovery programs, mental conditioning under exhaustion, all designed around a single obsession, creating men capable of continuing long after normal humans stopped functioning. And maybe the most shocking part is this. It worked because Rome conquered enormous territories not simply through numbers but through consistency, the ability to outmarch, outbuild, and outlast nearly everyone they fought. And hidden beneath all the armor and battlefield glory lies something deeply fascinating about human potential itself. Because Roman soldiers were not born superhuman, most began as farmers, laborers, ordinary young men pulled from villages and fields. Yet through relentless conditioning, Rome reshaped their bodies and minds into something closer to living engines than temporary militia. And honestly, when you start studying how they achieved this, the entire ancient world begins looking different. Because suddenly Rome's dominance stops feeling mysterious. It becomes physical, measurable, built mile after mile through sweat, pain, repetition, and terrifying discipline. And perhaps that is the most unsettling realization of all. Rome did not rely on magic, destiny, or heroic myths. It relied on systems, systems capable of transforming ordinary people into soldiers who could keep moving when everyone else collapsed. And in many ways, that idea still shapes military thinking even today, because modern armies continue chasing the same impossible dream Rome pursued over 2,000 years ago. How do you build human beings who refuse to quit? Rome did not create its terrifying military system because it admired discipline for its own sake. It created it because survival demanded it. Because unlike smaller kingdoms fighting occasional border wars, Rome existed inside almost constant conflict for centuries. Enemies surrounded them from every direction: Gauls in the north, Carthaginians across the sea, Greek kingdoms in the east, Germanic tribes beyond the frontier, rebellions inside conquered territories. And perhaps most dangerous of all, Rome's enemies often outnumbered them dramatically. Entire tribal coalitions could field armies far larger than a single Roman force, which meant Rome faced a brutal mathematical problem from the beginning. If you cannot always outnumber your enemies, you must outperform them. And this realization changed everything about how Romans approached warfare. Because while many ancient cultures glorified individual heroism and explosive courage, Rome became obsessed with sustainability, endurance, systems that could continue functioning under pressure longer than anyone else. And perhaps nowhere was this fear of collapse more visible than after the disaster at Cana in 216 BC. One of the worst military defeats in human history, where Hannibal annihilated tens of thousands of Roman soldiers in a single afternoon, entire generations erased beneath dust and blood, while terrified survivors fled the battlefield. And honestly, it is difficult to exaggerate how traumatic this moment was for Roman society. Because for a brief horrifying period it looked like Rome itself might disappear completely, destroyed not because its soldiers lacked bravery, but because they exhausted themselves against a more flexible enemy, and Rome learned something terrifying from that catastrophe. Courage without endurance eventually breaks, and after Cana, the Roman military became even more ruthless about conditioning, because the stakes were no longer abstract. Defeat meant extinction, entire civilization hanging on whether exhausted soldiers could continue fighting just a little longer than their enemies. And perhaps modern audiences underestimate how physically demanding ancient warfare truly was, because Hollywood often portrays battles as chaotic bursts of violence lasting minutes. But real combat involved hours of marching, carrying heavy gear, maintaining formation beneath heat or rain, pushing shields against enemy lines, swinging weapons repeatedly while adrenaline drained energy rapidly, all before modern medicine, modern nutrition, or modern rest recovery existed. And Roman territory itself made things even harder, because the empire eventually stretched across thousands of miles, forcing armies to march enormous distances before battles even began. Imagine walking for weeks carrying armor, weapons, tools, food supplies, then immediately fighting disciplined enemies upon arrival. Most ancient armies simply could not sustain that level of effort consistently. But Rome needed soldiers who could, because their empire depended on movement, roads, communication, rapid response. And perhaps that is why the Roman military budget became so enormous, consuming astonishing portions of state wealth. Because Rome understood something many civilizations ignored. Properly trained soldiers multiply power far beyond their numbers. One conditioned legionary capable of marching all day and still fighting effectively at sunset might outperform several exhausted opponents combined. And hidden inside all this is one of the earliest examples of institutionalized performance science in human history. Because Rome did not merely hope soldiers became tougher naturally. It systematically studied what increased endurance and what weakened it, testing march distances, training durations, equipment loads, even food types, refining military conditioning across generations through brutal trial and error. And maybe that is what makes Rome feel strangely modern compared to many ancient civilizations. They treated human performance almost scientifically centuries before laboratories existed, observing patterns, adapting systems, optimizing efficiency relentlessly. And perhaps that relentless pragmatism explains why Rome remained dominant for so long. Because while other armies relied heavily on courage, tribal identity, or charismatic leaders, Rome invested in repeatable systems capable of producing durable soldiers generation after generation. And the result terrified their enemies. Because once battle dragged into exhaustion, once fear and fatigue started destroying discipline, Roman legions often remained standing when everyone else began collapsing, and in the ancient world that difference could decide the fate of nations. Most ancient armies followed a brutally simple formula: hand a recruit a spear, teach him which direction to face, scream loud enough to make him charge, then hope courage carried him through the chaos of battle. But Rome looked at that approach and considered it dangerously inefficient, because courage fades quickly once exhaustion takes control of the body, and Roman commanders understood something revolutionary for the ancient world. Discipline under fatigue mattered more than temporary bravery, so before a recruit ever touched a real battlefield, Rome subjected him to a transformation process so relentless that many modern people would struggle to comprehend it. 4 months minimum of near-constant physical and psychological pressure, designed to strip away weakness and rebuild endurance from the ground up. And perhaps what makes this system so shocking is not merely its brutality, but its precision. Because the Romans did not torture recruits randomly, they created a carefully engineered process intended to reshape the human body into something capable of sustained warfare. Dawn began with running, not casual jogging but hard, exhausting runs carrying gear across uneven terrain while instructors screamed commands through freezing mornings or blazing summer heat. And when the running ended, weapon drills began immediately, thousands of repetitive movements repeated until shoulders burned. Hands blistered and arms trembled uncontrollably, because Rome believed muscle memory saved lives when panic arrived in combat. The body needed to obey automatically even after the mind started failing. And perhaps the most terrifying detail is that exhaustion was never considered an excuse to stop. It was considered the exact moment training truly began, because Roman officers wanted recruits functioning while tired, thinking while exhausted, obeying while physically miserable. And this is where the system becomes strangely recognizable to modern elite military programs, because contemporary special forces training often uses similar principles, pushing soldiers beyond comfort specifically to observe who maintains discipline once the body begins begging for relief. Except Roman recruits endured this constantly for months without modern recovery methods, modern footwear, sports medicine, or nutrition science. And failure carried consequences far beyond embarrassment, because men unable to complete training were often publicly humiliated and assigned degrading labor roles rather than simply dismissed. Rome understood shame as a weapon almost as effective as fear. And perhaps that sounds cruel today, but Roman society itself operated on a brutal logic. Weakness endangered entire units, and entire units protected the state. So conditioning became almost sacred. Because if one exhausted soldier broke formation during battle, the consequences could spread catastrophically through hundreds of men. And perhaps the most fascinating part of this system is how observant Roman military physicians actually were, because they tracked physical changes in recruits carefully, documenting lower resting heart rates and improved stamina long before humans understood cardiovascular science formally. They recognized that bodies adapted under sustained stress, that endurance could be built systematically rather than left to chance. And hidden inside all this is one of the earliest examples of institutionalized sports physiology in recorded history. Except instead of Olympic medals, the reward was surviving warfare. And Rome refined these methods through generations, discovering that shorter training created unreliable soldiers while excessively long preparation wasted resources. 4 months became the sweet spot. Enough time to transform peasant laborers into conditioned legionaries capable of marching, building, and fighting continuously. And maybe that is the detail modern audiences miss most often. Roman training was not designed to create individual champions. It was designed to create repeatable reliability. Soldiers who would continue functioning predictably under horrible conditions regardless of fear, weather, exhaustion, or chaos. And perhaps that is why Roman armies felt so terrifying to enemies accustomed to less disciplined warfare. Because they were not facing temporary militia inspired by emotion. They were facing human beings conditioned systematically to continue operating after normal limits should have stopped them. And by the time recruits completed those 4 months, Rome had already achieved something extraordinary. It had taken ordinary young men and taught them to distrust comfort entirely. Because comfort became weakness, and endurance became identity itself. If Roman training camps forged discipline, then the marches forged something even more important. Endurance that bordered on the unnatural, because Rome understood a truth that many ancient armies ignored completely. Wars are usually decided long before the battle actually begins. They are decided by who arrives first, who arrives organized, who arrives with enough strength left to fight after the journey ends. And perhaps that sounds simple until you remember what Roman soldiers were expected to carry across enormous distances: armor, weapons, shields, cooking equipment, tools for digging, food rations, personal belongings, sometimes 60 to 80 pounds strapped to the body, while moving mile after mile over stone roads, muddy trails, mountain paths, and open wilderness. And they did this repeatedly, not once for glory, not occasionally for emergencies, but constantly because marching became the foundation of Roman military identity itself. And perhaps nothing reveals Rome's obsession with conditioning more clearly than the standard training march. Nearly 20 miles completed within 5 hours while fully loaded, a pace many healthy modern adults would struggle to maintain even without heavy equipment. And Roman recruits repeated these marches again and again, until movement under crushing weight became normal, until the body adapted to hardship so completely that exhaustion stopped feeling exceptional and started feeling routine. And honestly, there's something almost frightening about the psychological transformation involved there. Because once human beings normalize suffering physically, they become capable of enduring conditions that would destroy untrained people quickly. And the Romans discovered this centuries before exercise science could explain why it worked. Because repeated weighted marches force the body to build additional capillaries, strengthen connective tissue, increase cardiovascular efficiency, harden bones through constant impact. All adaptations modern physiology now understands scientifically. But Rome observed through experience, noticing simply that soldiers who marched relentlessly survived and performed better than those who did not. And perhaps the most remarkable part is that the standard marches were considered merely the baseline, because during emergencies, Roman legions executed forced marches exceeding 30 miles a day for consecutive days, while still remaining battle-ready afterward. Julius Caesar's campaigns provide almost unbelievable examples. Entire armies covering distances enemies considered impossible, appearing suddenly at fortified towns before defenders even realized danger approached. And maybe that is one reason Roman warfare felt psychologically overwhelming to opponents, because Rome moved with terrifying consistency, its soldiers functioning almost like parts inside a machine, rather than exhausted individuals struggling independently. And hidden beneath all this physical conditioning lies another crucial Roman insight. Endurance creates strategic freedom, because the farther and faster your army can travel, the more unpredictable and adaptable your empire becomes. Enemies expecting weeks of warning suddenly faced organized legions in days. Rebellions collapsed before momentum fully developed, and commanders gained options unavailable to slower forces, which meant Roman endurance was not merely athletic achievement. It was political power translated directly through the human body. And perhaps the most astonishing detail is that soldiers continued additional labor after these marches ended, constructing camps, gathering supplies, maintaining equipment, meaning their bodies adapted not just to isolated bursts of effort, but to continuous workload over entire days, exactly the kind of sustained output warfare demanded. And modern trainers call this work capacity now, the ability to perform large amounts of physical labor without catastrophic fatigue. But Rome built entire armies around the concept 2,000 years earlier without using any modern terminology at all. And maybe that's what makes Roman military history feel strangely unsettling today, because it reveals how much human performance can change under systematic conditioning. These were not genetically superior men. They were ordinary people reshaped by relentless repetition into soldiers whose bodies responded differently to exhaustion itself. And by the time a Roman legion finally reached battle after weeks of marching, the enemy often faced something psychologically devastating: men who still looked ready to keep going. When modern people imagine powerful ancient warriors, they often picture mountains of roasted meat, giant feasts overflowing with animal protein and wine. But Rome approached military nutrition with the same ruthless practicality it applied to everything else. And strangely enough, the empire that conquered enormous portions of the known world fueled its soldiers primarily with grain, not because Romans were primitive or lacked access to meat, but because they discovered through experience something modern endurance athletes would rediscover thousands of years later. Carbohydrates sustain long-term energy better than heavy meat diets during prolonged exertion, And perhaps that realization alone reveals how observant Roman commanders actually were, because they noticed patterns between diet and performance centuries before calories, glycogen, or metabolism had names. Soldiers eating too much meat became sluggish during marches, tired faster under heavy loads, struggled more during sustained labor, while grain-fed legionaries maintained steadier energy across entire days of movement and combat. And once Rome recognized this relationship, military nutrition became another carefully engineered part of the empire's endurance machine. Every legionary receiving large daily grain rations that provided thousands of slow-burning calories capable of supporting relentless physical output. But perhaps the most fascinating detail is that the grain usually arrived unprocessed. Whole wheat requiring soldiers to grind flour themselves every evening after exhausting marches, which sounds almost absurdly cruel until you realize Rome viewed even food preparation as conditioning, another layer of repetitive labor strengthening muscles and discipline simultaneously. Because Roman military culture treated idleness almost like a threat. Every moment became an opportunity to reinforce endurance physically or psychologically. And honestly, there's something deeply revealing about that mindset, the belief that human beings could always be pushed slightly further through structured effort. And perhaps this is where Rome begins feeling less like a traditional ancient kingdom and more like a civilization obsessed with optimization itself, because even their drinks reflected practical performance concerns. Pasca, that infamous mixture of water and vinegar many soldiers consumed daily, sounds disgusting to modern ears. But it solved multiple problems efficiently, acidic enough to reduce bacterial contamination in questionable water supplies, while replacing salts lost through constant sweating during marches, essentially functioning as a crude electrolyte drink centuries before sports beverages existed. And once again Rome discovered effective solutions through observation rather than scientific theory, because survival and performance punished mistakes brutally in military campaigns. Ineffective practices disappeared quickly, while useful ones spread across generations. And perhaps the deeper lesson hidden here is how closely Roman military success depended on consistency rather than spectacle. There was nothing glamorous about grinding grain after 20-mile marches or drinking watered vinegar beneath rain-soaked tents. But those habits created soldiers capable of sustaining enormous workloads, while enemies exhausted themselves chasing short bursts of intensity. And food itself became communal in fascinating ways, squads cooking together, eating together, sharing preparation duties not merely for convenience but for trust and accountability. Because Rome understood armies function best when soldiers depend on each other constantly, even basic survival tasks reinforcing group cohesion psychologically. And maybe that is another overlooked reason Roman legions endured so effectively under pressure. Their entire daily existence revolved around systems of shared labor and mutual reliance, making discipline feel less individual and more collective. Everyone marched together, cooked together, built camps together, fought together, suffered together. And over time, those shared hardships forged identities stronger than temporary fear or exhaustion. And perhaps modern audiences underestimate how much energy ancient warfare actually consumed. Because Roman soldiers were essentially endurance laborers carrying industrial-scale workloads using only human muscle. No engines, no vehicles transporting personal gear, no modern supplements accelerating recovery, just disciplined bodies fueled largely by grain and relentless routine. And maybe that is why Roman endurance still fascinates people today. Because beneath the armor and conquest lies a civilization that understood something profoundly important about performance long before science explained it. Extraordinary endurance rarely comes from dramatic secrets. It comes from mastering ordinary habits so consistently that the body itself begins changing in response. One of the most brilliant and almost cruelly effective ideas Rome ever developed began with a deceptively simple principle. If you train the body under greater strain than real combat demands, actual battle begins feeling lighter by comparison. And this philosophy shaped nearly every aspect of Roman weapons training, because Roman instructors deliberately forced recruits to practice with equipment heavier than the gear they would eventually carry into war. Wooden swords nearly twice the weight of real gladiatori, oversized shields exhausting the arms long before combat ever occurred. Endless repetitive drills designed not merely to teach technique, but to alter how soldiers physically experienced fatigue itself. And perhaps what makes this so remarkable is that modern sports science now recognizes the exact same principle under names like overload training and resistance adaptation. Yet Rome discovered it through brutal experimentation nearly 2,000 years earlier without laboratories, exercise physiology, or biomechanics. Simply observing that soldiers trained under exaggerated conditions performed more efficiently once real weapons felt comparatively lighter. And honestly, there's something almost terrifying about how intelligently practical Roman training became, because they understood instinctively that human perception of effort could be manipulated. Exhaustion could be normalized gradually, until ordinary battle no longer felt overwhelming. And perhaps nowhere was this clearer than at the palace. The wooden training post every recruit attacked endlessly during drills, standing alone beneath sun or rain, while exhausted young men struck it again and again thousands of times, thrusting, stepping, shielding, repeating movements until their muscles burned uncontrollably. Because Roman officers believed discipline under fatigue mattered more than flashy technique. Real battles became chaotic quickly. Fear distorted judgment, bodies weakened. But soldiers whose movements had been drilled into muscle memory could continue functioning long after conscious thought began deteriorating. And maybe modern audiences struggle to appreciate how physically devastating these sessions truly were, because swinging even moderately weighted objects repeatedly for extended periods destroys the shoulders, wrists, back, and core with astonishing speed. Yet Roman recruits performed these drills daily for months, often after running and marching beforehand, transforming the body through sheer volume of controlled suffering. And over time, something fascinating happened. The impossible became ordinary. Recruits who once collapsed after minutes gradually discovered they could continue far longer than expected. Because the human nervous system adapts alongside muscles, learning efficiency, coordination, packing, how to conserve energy unconsciously during repetitive labor, and Rome exploited this adaptation relentlessly. Because endurance was never just about strength. It was about economy of movement, minimizing wasted effort while maximizing consistency. And perhaps that explains why Roman combat techniques emphasize short thrusts instead of dramatic slashing attacks favored by many tribal warriors. Because wide, powerful swings consume enormous energy quickly, while controlled stabbing motions preserve stamina across longer engagements. And once again, we see Rome approaching warfare almost scientifically, reducing combat into manageable systems optimized around endurance rather than spectacle. And maybe that practical mentality is precisely why Roman soldiers appeared so unsettling to enemies accustomed to more emotional forms of battle. Because Roman legionaries often fought with cold, repetitive efficiency, conserving energy carefully while opponents exhausted themselves through furious aggression. And hidden beneath all these physical drills was another critical psychological transformation. Recruits learned to stop fearing discomfort itself. Pain became familiar, exhaustion became routine, heavy equipment stopped feeling unnatural, and perhaps that psychological adaptation mattered just as much as the muscular one, because many battles are lost not when bodies physically fail, but when minds decide suffering has become unbearable. And Rome trained soldiers specifically to distrust that impulse, to continue functioning despite fatigue signals screaming for rest. And over time, those repeated lessons created something extraordinary. Men who entered battle already accustomed to physical misery, already conditioned to keep moving through pain while maintaining discipline. And perhaps that is the real secret hidden behind Roman endurance, not superhuman strength, but the systematic reshaping of what ordinary human beings considered possible. Most ancient armies ended a long march the same way exhausted travelers throughout history have always ended difficult journeys. They stopped moving, collapsed beside fires, and tried desperately to recover enough strength for tomorrow. But Rome considered that approach dangerously vulnerable, because tired soldiers sleeping in open ground could be ambushed, scattered, or slaughtered before sunrise. And perhaps more importantly, Roman commanders believed endurance itself could be trained through continuous workload rather than isolated effort. So, after marching nearly 20 miles carrying crushing equipment beneath heat, rain, or freezing wind, Roman legions performed one final task before resting. They built an entire fortified camp from scratch, every single night, without exception: trenches, walls, gates, organized streets, defensive positions, all constructed by exhausted men whose bodies already screamed for relief. And honestly, this is the moment where Roman military culture starts feeling almost inhuman to modern audiences, because most people struggle to imagine performing hours of hard construction labor after a physically devastating day. Yet Roman soldiers repeated this routine constantly for years, and perhaps the strangest part is that Rome did not view this as punishment. It viewed it as strategic conditioning, because the empire understood something modern performance coaches still emphasize today. Work capacity increases only when the body repeatedly adapts to sustained output beyond comfort levels, and by forcing soldiers to dig trenches and erect fortifications while already exhausted. Rome trained the body and mind to continue functioning under cumulative fatigue rather than temporary effort alone, essentially teaching soldiers how to remain productive even after they should have been depleted. And over time, these nightly camps became astonishingly sophisticated: defensive ditches carved quickly into the earth, sharpened stakes forming protective barriers, organized layouts allowing rapid movement even in darkness, entire temporary cities appearing beside roads almost mechanically before disappearing again at dawn. And perhaps that routine created another massive advantage most enemies failed to anticipate. Roman soldiers actually rested better because of it, because while tribal armies remained vulnerable to surprise attacks during sleep, Roman camps became miniature fortresses terrifying to assault at night, meaning legionaries could recover behind secure defenses while enemies stayed anxious and alert beyond the perimeter. And hidden inside this exhausting ritual lies one of Rome's greatest psychological strengths: routine itself. Because once soldiers repeated the same difficult tasks thousands of times, discipline became automatic, fear diminished through familiarity, and even massive labor projects stopped feeling extraordinary. Some veteran legionaries reportedly capable of constructing trenches almost mechanically while half asleep, their bodies conditioned through endless repetition until movement itself became instinctive. And maybe that is one reason Roman armies felt so unstoppable historically. Not because individual soldiers were fearless heroes, but because the military system reduced uncertainty constantly through routine. Everyone knew what happened after marching, after battles, after camp setup, predictability stabilizing the mind under extreme stress. And perhaps modern people underestimate how mentally exhausting uncertainty can become during hardship, because confusion burns energy rapidly, while systems conserve it. And Rome built systems for nearly everything: marching, eating, fighting, sleeping, building, recovering, creating soldiers whose daily existence followed structured rhythms even inside chaos. And perhaps that structure itself became a weapon, because disciplined routines preserve efficiency, while exhausted opponents descend gradually into disorder. And there's another fascinating detail here too. These nightly camps constantly reinforced practical engineering skills across the army, ordinary soldiers becoming experienced builders through endless repetition, understanding terrain, drainage, defensive positioning, logistics, all without formal schooling, because Rome believed versatility increased survival. A legionary needed to fight, march, dig, build, repair, and adapt continuously, almost like a mobile civilization carried physically across the landscape. And maybe that is the deeper truth behind Roman endurance. They did not merely train soldiers to resist fatigue. They built an entire culture where relentless labor became normal, where hardship stopped feeling exceptional and started feeling expected. And once human beings normalize extraordinary effort collectively, their limits begin shifting in ways that seem almost impossible from the outside. Most ancient battles eventually dissolved into chaos, screaming warriors colliding in waves of exhaustion, where victory usually belonged to whichever side still had enough strength left to keep swinging weapons after hours of violence. And for centuries, armies simply accepted this as inevitable. Battle was supposed to become disorganized, emotional, desperate. But Rome studied that chaos carefully and realized something extraordinary. Exhaustion itself could be controlled, managed, even weaponized strategically. And perhaps this insight transformed Roman warfare more than any sword, shield, or famous general ever did. Because instead of allowing soldiers to fight until collapse individually, Rome built entire battlefield systems designed around conserving energy collectively. And the result felt almost supernatural to enemies accustomed to traditional combat. Warriors who seemed incapable of tiring no matter how long the battle lasted, because while opponents exhausted themselves through constant uninterrupted fighting, Roman lines rotated fresh men forward continuously, tired soldiers slipping backward through carefully designed gaps in formation, while rested legionaries stepped seamlessly into their place, almost like parts moving inside a machine rather than frightened human beings fighting for survival. And honestly, it must have looked horrifying from the enemy perspective. Imagine struggling through exhausting combat for an hour only to discover the Roman soldier facing you suddenly withdraws calmly, and another equally disciplined man immediately replaces him, fully rested, shield steady, breathing controlled, while your own muscles burn and your heartbeat pounds uncontrollably. Because this was the true genius of Roman warfare. Not raw aggression, but sustained efficiency. And perhaps the most remarkable part is how much trust this system required. Soldiers stepping backward during battle without panic, others filling spaces instantly without hesitation, entire formations functioning cooperatively despite fear, noise, blood, and confusion everywhere around them. Because Rome understood something many tribal armies never fully accepted. Disciplined teamwork preserves energy better than individual heroics. And perhaps that explains why enemies so often described Roman legions as eerily relentless, because they were not watching individual warriors fight independently. They were confronting an organized system designed specifically to prevent fatigue from spreading through the line. And hidden beneath these tactical rotations lay another critical Roman advantage. Psychological pressure, because exhaustion destroys morale as much as physical ability. Once soldiers feel themselves weakening while the enemy still appears disciplined, panic spreads rapidly, movements become sloppy, formations collapse, and Rome exploited this repeatedly, allowing opponents to burn through emotional fury early while legionaries conserved strength methodically for the decisive moments later. And maybe that is why so many ancient accounts describe enemies becoming frustrated or demoralized fighting Romans, because traditional warrior cultures often valued visible aggression and personal glory. Yet Roman soldiers responded with cold repetition, measured movements, controlled breathing, short efficient thrusts, instead of exhausting dramatic swings, almost refusing emotionally chaotic battle entirely. And perhaps that restraint itself became psychologically exhausting for opponents expecting fear, rage, or recklessness in return. And modern sports psychology actually supports much of this ancient Roman thinking, because panic consumes enormous energy rapidly, while calm, disciplined movement preserves endurance far longer. And Rome recognized this intuitively centuries before modern science explained why, training soldiers to control breathing between attacks, maintain formation automatically, reduce unnecessary motion, all tiny details adding up across hours of combat until the difference became overwhelming. And maybe that is the most unsettling lesson hidden inside Roman battlefield tactics. Victory often belongs not to the strongest or bravest individually, but to the group capable of remaining organized while everyone else deteriorates into exhaustion and fear. And Rome built entire armies around that principle so successfully that enemies sometimes genuinely believed the legions possessed superhuman stamina, when in reality they were witnessing something even more dangerous: a civilization that had systematically engineered discipline itself into a weapon. By the time Roman recruits mastered marching, construction, weapons drills, and battlefield formations, most ancient armies would have considered them fully prepared for war. But Rome believed something even more extreme. A true soldier needed to remain dangerous after everything went wrong, after formations collapsed, after weapons broke, after exhaustion blurred thought and survival became pure instinct. And perhaps that belief explains why Roman military conditioning expanded far beyond ordinary combat practice into activities that initially seem almost absurdly demanding: swimming in armor, wrestling until physical collapse, fighting barehanded under exhaustion, because Rome understood warfare as chaos rather than ceremony, and chaotic situations demanded bodies capable of adapting under extreme stress. And honestly, when you start examining these training methods carefully, the Roman military begins looking less like an ancient army and more like one of the earliest full-spectrum performance systems in history, because every exercise connected to multiple battlefield purposes simultaneously. And perhaps nothing demonstrates this better than swimming drills, which every legionary was expected to learn regardless of background, not because Rome valued athletics recreationally, but because rivers killed armies constantly: flooding, drowning, broken formations during crossings, entire campaigns collapsing because exhausted soldiers could not move effectively through water while carrying equipment. So Rome solved the problem directly, forcing recruits to train inside rivers wearing heavy gear until panic disappeared and breathing adapted under resistance. And hidden inside this brutal practicality was another physiological benefit modern science now recognizes clearly. Water resistance training dramatically strengthens cardiovascular endurance and lung capacity, meaning Roman soldiers unknowingly developed respiratory conditioning centuries before anyone understood oxygen efficiency formally. And perhaps that explains why so many enemies described legionaries as frighteningly tireless during prolonged engagements, because their lungs themselves had adapted through endless hardship. And then there was wrestling. Not ceremonial sport, but exhausting grappling intended to continue until one participant physically could not continue moving, because Roman commanders recognized an uncomfortable battlefield reality many heroic cultures ignored. Real combat eventually becomes ugly, close, desperate. Shields break, weapons disappear into mud, soldiers trip over bodies, and the person still capable of functioning physically under exhaustion often survives regardless of elegance or honor. So Roman recruits learned to fight through fatigue rather than avoid it. And maybe that is one of the deepest philosophical differences between Rome and many opponents. Roman military culture cared far less about glorious moments than repeatable survival. Effectiveness mattered more than spectacle, endurance more than dramatic bravery. And perhaps that mindset itself explains much of Rome's longevity historically. Because civilizations obsessed with practical systems often outlast cultures built primarily around emotional intensity alone. And hidden beneath all these physical exercises was another terrifying Roman insight. The mind usually surrenders before the body truly fails. Modern neuroscience supports this strongly now. Fatigue signals often function partly as protective warnings rather than absolute physical limits. But Rome discovered versions of this through observation long ago, noticing soldiers could continue functioning under exhaustion far beyond what seemed initially possible if discipline and routine overrode panic. So training intentionally pushed recruits into states of extreme fatigue before forcing them to perform complex drills, memorize commands, build defenses, because commanders wanted automatic responses surviving even after rational thought weakened. And perhaps that sounds harsh, But from Rome's perspective, it was practical compassion in a brutal world, because battlefields punished hesitation mercilessly, and conditioned instincts saved lives when fear overwhelmed conscious decision-making. And maybe that is why Roman military discipline became legendary across the ancient world, not simply because punishments were severe, though they certainly were, but because the entire system systematically trained soldiers to keep functioning when exhausted minds screamed for relief. And over time, those repeated experiences reshaped identity itself. Legionaries beginning to see hardship not as exceptional suffering, but as normal existence, discomfort becoming expected rather than feared. And perhaps that transformation explains the eerie confidence many Roman veterans displayed historically, because after years of surviving endless marches, construction labor, freezing camps, brutal drills, and controlled exhaustion, ordinary battlefield hardship no longer felt extraordinary. And once human beings stop fearing exhaustion psychologically, they become far more dangerous physically than most opponents can comprehend. Long before psychology became a science, long before neuroscientists studied stress responses or military researchers analyzed combat fatigue, Rome had already stumbled onto one of the most important truths about human endurance. The brain usually quits before the body does, and perhaps this realization changed Roman warfare as profoundly as any sword, road, or battlefield tactic. Because once commanders understood that panic and mental exhaustion destroy performance faster than physical weakness alone, training stopped being only about muscles and became something much darker, conditioning the mind itself to function calmly inside terror. And honestly, this may have been the most frightening aspect of the Roman military machine. Because while many armies trained soldiers how to fight, Rome trained soldiers how to continue fighting after fear should have broken them psychologically. And the methods they used sound shockingly modern in some ways, forcing exhausted recruits to solve formation problems after brutal marches, memorizing battlefield responses until reactions became automatic, drilling commands endlessly so hesitation disappeared under pressure. Because Roman commanders recognized something most ancient armies ignored completely. Thinking under stress burns enormous energy. Confusion accelerates panic. Panic accelerates exhaustion. And exhausted, frightened soldiers stop functioning as organized units terrifyingly fast. So Rome reduced uncertainty wherever possible, replacing emotional reaction with conditioned routine. And perhaps that is why Roman battlefield discipline felt almost unnatural to enemies accustomed to chaotic warrior cultures, because legionaries often moved with eerie calm even while surrounded by screaming violence, arrows, blood, collapsing formations. And hidden beneath that calm was years of repetitive mental conditioning, teaching them exactly how to respond before panic could fully take control. And maybe the most fascinating detail is how closely modern science supports these ancient practices. Because contemporary studies show mental fatigue dramatically lowers physical performance even when muscles remain capable of continuing, the brain essentially begins protecting the body preemptively, creating sensations of overwhelming exhaustion before true collapse occurs. And Rome exploited this unknowingly by repeatedly exposing soldiers to controlled hardship, until the mind stopped interpreting discomfort as immediate danger, teaching recruits through experience that they could continue functioning long after instinct demanded rest. And perhaps nowhere was this psychological conditioning clearer than in the sacramentum, the Roman military oath, because soldiers did not merely promise obedience casually. They swore sacred loyalty before gods, commanders, and fellow legionaries, binding personal identity directly into military duty itself. And that psychological commitment mattered enormously under pressure, because people often endure more suffering for collective identity than they ever would individually. And Rome understood this intuitively, using ritual, discipline, and shared hardship to transform ordinary recruits into members of something larger than themselves. Because isolated fear weakens quickly while collective purpose stabilizes behavior under stress. And perhaps this is another reason Roman armies remained functional under conditions that shattered many opponents. Soldiers no longer saw themselves merely as individuals struggling privately through exhaustion. They saw themselves as pieces inside a larger disciplined machine, expected to continue regardless of discomfort. And even breathing became part of the system. Controlled breaths between strikes helping regulate heart rates during combat, preventing panic from accelerating fatigue unnecessarily, which again sounds astonishingly modern for an ancient civilization. Because elite athletes and soldiers today still use similar techniques to maintain performance under stress. And maybe that is what makes Roman conditioning so fascinating historically. They discovered practical truths about human performance through observation and repetition centuries before science could explain why those methods worked. And hidden beneath all the armor and brutality lies a profoundly important insight about endurance itself. Human limits are partly psychological constructions shaped by expectation, fear, habit, and identity. And Rome spent generations systematically reshaping those factors until ordinary soldiers became capable of extraordinary persistence. And perhaps that is why the legions terrified so many enemies, because they were not simply confronting stronger men. They were confronting minds trained specifically to keep functioning while others psychologically unraveled. Most people look at Roman armor and see only protection. Metal plates, shields, helmets, weapons designed to keep soldiers alive in battle. But Rome viewed equipment very differently, because every piece of gear carried by a legionary served a second purpose beyond defense or attack: conserving energy. And perhaps this is one of the most overlooked reasons Roman soldiers appeared so unnaturally tireless compared to many enemies. Because while tribal warriors often valued intimidating appearance, individual craftsmanship, or dramatic weapon size, Rome engineered its military equipment around efficiency, sustainability, and endurance across hours of continuous combat. And honestly, the more closely you examine Roman gear, the more it starts resembling industrial design centuries ahead of its time, because nearly every detail reveals practical experimentation focused on reducing fatigue. And perhaps nowhere was this more obvious than the scutum, the massive curved Roman shield that terrified enemies across Europe and the Mediterranean, because at first glance it seems absurdly heavy and cumbersome. Yet the curved design distributed weight against the body, rather than forcing soldiers to support everything entirely with arm strength, allowing legionaries brief moments of partial rest even while remaining protected behind the shield wall. And modern historians who handle accurate replicas often describe the same surprising realization. The shield feels far more manageable than expected once positioned correctly, because Rome designed equipment to work with the body rather than against it. And the same philosophy shaped the gladius, the short Roman sword many enemies initially mocked for lacking the dramatic reach of longer tribal blades. But Rome understood something brutally practical. Long swords consume enormous energy when swung repeatedly, especially during prolonged battles, while shorter thrusting weapons kill efficiently using far less movement and far less stamina. And perhaps that perfectly captures Roman military philosophy overall. Eliminate unnecessary effort wherever possible, because preserved energy eventually becomes battlefield dominance. And hidden inside all these design choices lies a sophisticated understanding of biomechanics centuries before the word existed formally. Armor distributing weight across shoulders, torso, and hips rather than crushing one area continuously. Helmets allowing airflow to reduce overheating during combat. Standardized equipment ensuring soldiers could immediately replace broken weapons or shields without adjustment, because every item across the army functioned almost identically. And maybe that standardization itself became another secret weapon, because while many ancient armies relied heavily on individually customized gear, Roman logistics prioritized interchangeable functionality, reducing confusion and wasted movement during battle. And perhaps modern audiences underestimate how exhausting ancient combat actually became physically, because fighting while overheated inside heavy equipment destroys stamina rapidly, especially under Mediterranean heat or endless marching conditions. Yet Rome adapted equipment specifically to minimize these effects wherever possible. And maybe that is what makes Roman military engineering feel strangely modern. They constantly searched for tiny improvements compounding into massive long-term advantages. A slightly more efficient shield, slightly lighter armor distribution, slightly less wasted motion during combat, and across thousands of soldiers, those small differences became enormous strategic advantages over time. Because endurance is often won through accumulated efficiency rather than dramatic superiority. And perhaps there's another important psychological effect hidden inside effective equipment design too. Soldiers trust gear that functions reliably, confidence reducing stress while uncertainty accelerates fatigue and panic. And Roman legionaries carried equipment refined through generations of warfare, systems tested repeatedly across countless campaigns until only the most practical designs survived, creating armies that not only fought efficiently but believed deeply in the reliability of their tools. And maybe that belief mattered more than we realize historically. Because exhausted soldiers fighting with trusted systems remain calmer under pressure than opponents relying on individual improvisation alone. And over centuries, Rome transformed warfare into something disturbingly methodical, not merely brave men clashing chaotically, but coordinated endurance supported by engineering, logistics, psychology, and repetition all working together. And perhaps that is why Roman military dominance lasted so long. Because Rome did not depend entirely on exceptional individuals. It built systems where even ordinary soldiers gained extraordinary advantages through discipline and design combined. Perhaps the most astonishing thing about Roman military endurance is that it did not end after training camps or battlefield victories, because Rome understood something almost no ancient civilization fully grasped. Keeping soldiers alive and functional for decades mattered more than winning a single battle brilliantly. And this realization pushed Roman military organization into territory that feels shockingly modern even today. Permanent medical corps, battlefield surgeons, recovery systems, rehabilitation programs, all designed around one central objective: returning exhausted or wounded soldiers back into operational condition as quickly as possible. Because Rome did not see legionaries merely as disposable bodies. It saw them as long-term investments requiring maintenance. And honestly, that perspective alone separated Rome from many ancient rivals whose armies often collapsed after losing experienced veterans, while Roman systems continuously repaired and recycled combat effectiveness across generations. And perhaps nothing demonstrates this better than the valetudinaria, the military hospitals traveling alongside Roman campaigns. Because these were not primitive tents where wounded men simply waited to die. They were surprisingly organized medical facilities with dedicated wards, surgical areas, recovery spaces, and trained staff focused specifically on treatment and rehabilitation, which sounds remarkably advanced for the ancient world because it was. And hidden inside this medical system was another practical Roman discovery centuries ahead of its time. Complete inactivity often slowed recovery more than controlled movement did, meaning wounded soldiers encouraged to remain somewhat active healed faster than those left entirely bedridden. A principle modern sports medicine would later rediscover formally thousands of years afterward. And perhaps that reveals something deeply fascinating about Roman culture generally. They observed results relentlessly, caring less about abstract theories than practical outcomes. If a treatment improved recovery consistently, Rome adopted it regardless of whether anyone fully understood the science behind it. And this same pragmatic mentality shaped Roman battlefield medicine too: vinegar, wine, and honey, used repeatedly on wounds because physicians noticed lower infection rates afterward. Crude by modern standards certainly, yet astonishingly effective relative to many ancient alternatives. And maybe the most important result was statistical rather than dramatic. Roman soldiers surviving initial injuries often returned to active duty far more frequently than wounded troops in later medieval armies, because Rome built systems specifically designed to preserve long-term military functionality rather than accepting attrition passively. And perhaps that is where Roman endurance becomes truly frightening historically, because it was not temporary conditioning alone. It became cumulative across entire careers. Legionaries serving 20 or even 25 years under constant physical stress until their bodies adapted permanently, bones thickening under endless weighted marches, hearts enlarging through sustained cardiovascular strain, lungs expanding through years of labor and combat, veteran soldiers physically transformed by decades inside the Roman military machine. And some historians studying skeletal remains describe Roman veterans almost like endurance athletes shaped through industrial-scale conditioning long before modern sports existed formally. And perhaps the strangest detail of all is that older Roman veterans often outperformed younger recruits despite age, because endurance compounds over time under consistent adaptation, something modern physiology fully recognizes now. Meaning 40-year-old legionaries with 20 years of conditioning sometimes possessed astonishing stamina compared to inexperienced younger men, and Rome deliberately preserved this experience through its retirement systems. Land grants encouraging veterans to remain connected to Roman society while serving as reserve manpower and teachers for future generations, creating institutional memory stretching across centuries. And maybe that is the real secret behind Roman military dominance. Not individual genius commanders or isolated battlefield innovations, but a civilization capable of sustaining performance systematically across generations, continuously refining conditioning, logistics, medicine, engineering, psychology, and discipline into one enormous interconnected machine designed to produce tireless soldiers repeatedly. And perhaps that explains why so many later empires spent centuries trying unsuccessfully to replicate Roman endurance. Because copying weapons or tactics proved far easier than copying the culture underneath them, the obsession with routine, efficiency, recovery, adaptation, and relentless practicality shaping ordinary men into something history had rarely seen before. Soldiers conditioned not merely to survive hardship temporarily, but to endure it continuously year after year without breaking completely. And maybe that is the most unsettling truth hidden inside Rome's military success. The empire did not accidentally create tireless soldiers. It engineered them deliberately through systems so effective that echoes of those methods still survive in military and athletic training, even now. 2,000 years later, long after the legions disappeared, the roads crumbled, and the empire itself collapsed beneath the weight of time. Something astonishing still remains alive from ancient Rome, not just architecture or law or language, but a philosophy of endurance so effective that modern militaries, elite athletes, and performance scientists still unknowingly echo parts of it today. Because beneath all the armor and conquest lies a deeper story about human potential itself. Rome discovered that ordinary people can become capable of extraordinary endurance when training, psychology, nutrition, engineering, and community all work together systematically. And perhaps that is the real reason Roman soldiers continue fascinating us centuries later. Not because they were superhuman, but because they were painfully human, farmers, laborers, young recruits dragged from villages, and transformed gradually through repetition, hardship, discipline. An adaptation into men capable of surviving workloads most modern people would consider impossible. And maybe that realization feels unsettling, because it forces us to confront how flexible human limits actually are. Because the Roman military machine proved something profoundly important long before science explained it formally. The body changes according to what survival repeatedly demands from it. Endurance is built, not inherited. And perhaps modern society has forgotten that truth in many ways, because comfort now surrounds daily life so completely that most people rarely test the outer edges of their own resilience physically or psychologically. While Roman soldiers lived inside continuous adaptation, every march reshaping muscles and lungs, every night camp reinforcing discipline, every battle refining emotional control under stress. And hidden beneath all this is another timeless lesson: Rome understood better than many civilizations before or after. Consistency matters more than intensity alone, because the legions did not dominate through occasional heroic efforts. They dominated through relentless routine repeated year after year across generations, small practical systems accumulating into overwhelming long-term advantages. And perhaps that principle still defines elite performance today, whether in sports, military training, medicine, or even ordinary life, because sustainable discipline almost always outlasts temporary motivation. And maybe that is why Rome still feels strangely modern compared to many ancient empires. They approached human performance like engineers rather than dreamers, constantly refining methods, removing inefficiency, observing results, adapting systems. And while other armies celebrated individual glory, Rome built repeatable structures capable of producing disciplined endurance at massive scale. And honestly, there's something both inspiring and slightly terrifying about that realization, because it reveals how powerful institutions become once they understand how to systematically shape human behavior and physical adaptation over long periods. And perhaps that is the darker side of Roman greatness too, because the same systems that created legendary endurance also consumed enormous amounts of human suffering: endless drills, exhausting marches, brutal punishments, psychological pressure, entire lives shaped around warfare and obedience. And maybe that contradiction is exactly why Rome continues haunting modern imagination, because it demonstrates both the incredible resilience and the dangerous malleability of human beings under organized systems. And perhaps the final irony is this: many enemies initially dismissed Roman soldiers as rigid, overly disciplined, even unimaginative compared to fierce tribal warriors fighting with passion and individual freedom. Yet century after century Rome kept winning, not because its soldiers lacked fear or pain, but because they learned to continue functioning despite them. And maybe that is the ultimate lesson hidden inside the story of Roman endurance. Greatness rarely comes from eliminating hardship entirely. It comes from adapting to hardship more effectively than everyone else. Because in the end, Rome did not conquer much of the ancient world through magic, destiny, or superhuman strength. It conquered through relentless preparation, ordinary bodies conditioned beyond ordinary limits until exhaustion itself became just another obstacle to manage rather than a reason to stop. And perhaps that is why the image of the legionary still feels powerful after all this time. A tired soldier beneath heavy armor still marching forward mile after mile, because somewhere deep inside the Roman system, he had been taught a terrifyingly simple belief: the body can continue long after the mind says quit. The Roman Empire did not create unstoppable soldiers through strength alone. It built an entire system designed to manufacture endurance, discipline, and resilience across generations. Through relentless training, psychological conditioning, engineering, nutrition, and recovery, Rome discovered that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary performance when pushed beyond comfort consistently. The legacy of the legions reminds us that human limits are often far more flexible than we imagine, and that endurance, not explosive power, is what truly shapes history.